Chapter 21, Sunhee, 1945. It seemed as if the war would never end. Day after day of too much hard work, not enough food, constant exhaustion, and no chance to make or do anything beautiful. If a war lasts long enough, is it possible that people would completely forget the idea of beauty? That they'd only be able to do what they needed to survive and would no longer remember how to make and enjoy beautiful things. I was determined not to let this happen to me. At school every day, while I was working with my hands, I let my mind float away to think of something beautiful. The dragon pin buried safely in the backyard, the way the little pearl ball shone, white but with 100 unnamed colors gleaming. How the row of rows of Sharon trees had looked when in full bloom, each flower like an open mouth singing. Or the mountains outside town, how they used to turn green a little at a time in the spring, the color climbing higher with each warm day. I was afraid that if I didn't take time now to remember these things, I'd wake one day unable to recall them at all. Jeongsin had avoided me ever since the incident in the schoolyard with her sister. We hadn't spoken even once, and this left a large ragged hole in my life. The days of defense preparation work without her company were truly miserable. And as unhappy and uncomfortable as I felt, I could see whenever I glanced at her that she felt 100 times worse. Her shoulders were always slumped and her eyes dull. What Jeongsin's father did was the responsibility of the whole family. Her father's shame was hers as well. That was why she couldn't face me. I was sure she hadn't known her father was Chinripa before the day when I guessed, for she had seemed completely bewildered. I thought again of Uncle, how he'd never mentioned anything about Jeongsin's family. Now I thought I knew why. I hadn't known then what Uncle was doing, nor had Jeongsin known what her father was doing. We were just two girls playing together. That must have been what Uncle had thought. It was what I thought too. After school one day, I rushed out and found the popcorn man. If he was anywhere in town, he was easy to find. You just follow the sound of the loud banging noises, the popcorn inside the cannon. I bought a bag, then hurried to a street corner Jeongsin would pass on her way home. Soon she came along, walking slowly with her head down. She saw me standing there and her steps slowed even more. "Hello, miss," I called as she approached. "I hear you're good at cat's cradle. I would like to learn some new patterns. Don't worry, I can pay for the lesson." And I held out the bag of popcorn. It was a wonderful sight, the way her eyes instantly regained their sparkle. Right away, she began to play along. "Well, I don't know," she said, striking a contemplative pose. "I'm very good at cat's cradle, and I'm not sure if one bag of popcorn is enough payment." "Who said anything about one bag?" I said indignantly. "Some of this is for me. You know, I was offering half a bag." We laughed together, and I knew in that moment we could still be friends. One evening, late in winter, Taeil asked to speak to 아버지 alone. After supper, 어머니 and I immediately rose from our seats and left the room. We took the dishes to the back of the house, under the eaves, and washed them there, so the men would have some privacy. I was dying to know what Taeil had to say. I couldn't remember any other time that he'd asked to talk to 아버지 privately. There was quiet in the house for a little while, but as we were finishing the dishes, we heard 아버지's voice. He was shouting, "What do you mean by this? You would deliberately disobey my express command?" I was stunned. 아버지 never shouted. 어머니 immediately covered her ears with her hands and hissed at me to do the same. Reluctantly, I raised my hands to my ears. I knew it was rude to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help it. I covered my ears without completely blocking my hearing. I couldn't hear the words, only quiet. Then, more shouting. They argued for a long time, long enough for my legs to cramp. At last, there was silence. 어머니 cautiously lowered one hand. Then she told me to empty the water basin while she took the dishes back to the kitchen. 여보, 선희, 아버지 called in a stern voice. I dropped the basin and hurried inside. 아버지 was pacing back and forth in great agitation. Taeyul had obviously just bowed to him. He was on his knees on the other side of the low table. Unhappiness seemed to fill the space between them, the whole room. Following 어머니 in, I took only one step past the threshold and stood next to the sliding door, making myself as small as I could. Taeyul has something to say, 아버지 said. Taeyul swiveled on his knees and bowed his head to the ground toward my mother. Then he raised his head but kept his eyes down as he spoke. 어머니, today I enlisted in the Imperial Army. I leave for training in Seoul tomorrow. My legs turned to paper. I grabbed for the door frame to keep from falling as 어머니 cried out. Why? Why? You're too young. How? Taeyul's face was pale, but his voice was steady. I volunteered. At this, 어머니 threw her apron over her face and collapsed, sobbing wildly. 아버지 thrust out his hands in anger and shouted, Look at her! Look what you have done to your mother! Taeyul rose to his feet and bent over her. 어머니, please, he whispered. This was an old trick of uncle's. When we were younger, crying over some small hurt or disappointment, uncle would lower his voice and speak to us in a whisper. We had to stop crying in order to hear what he said. It always worked, and now here was Taeyul doing it as if he were the adult and 어머니 the child. It worked this time as well. 어머니 stopped crying and sat up. Taeyul bowed before her again. I ask all of you to try to understand, he said. The war is going badly for the Japanese. We know this. We can see it everywhere. They talk a lot about those kamikaze successes. But you can tell from that very tactic how desperate they are. The soldiers at the airstrip don't even have ammunition for many of their guns anymore. One more soldier, and an unwilling one at that, isn't going to make a difference in the outcome. The Japanese are losing. It's only a matter of time. But if I join the army, things will be much better for you. Families of volunteers receive rice rations and other considerations. Look at Sonny's clothes, he said bitterly, glancing over at me. It's a wonder they hold together now. There are more mending stitches than cloth. They'll give you clothing, better food. They'll treat you better. He was speaking to 어머니. He'd probably said all this to 아버지 earlier. I'm 18 years old now. I'm not a child anymore. I need to help the family the best way I can. 어머니 stared at him. And what help will you be to us if you die? She asked quietly. I knew what she was thinking. We'd heard rumors that Korean recruits were sent in at the start of any battle to clear the way for the Japanese soldiers behind them. The Koreans were always the first to die. If Taeyul were sent into battle, he'd be in the front line. For the first time, Taeyul shifted uncomfortably. It's a real possibility that the war will be over soon. I'll have several weeks of training before they send me anywhere. Perhaps the war will have ended by then. His voice trailed off. 어머니 shook her head dazedly. 아버지 had stopped his pacing and was standing with his shoulders bowed. It was impossible to even imagine Taeyul disobeying our parents in this way, yet here it was, happening before my very eyes. And for what reason? To join the army and fight on behalf of the Japanese. Suddenly, I was shouting, You pighead! Don't you know I'd rather have 1,000 patches in my clothes than lose my brother? In the next instant, I saw the shock on all their faces. I was a girl, a younger sister. I had no right to express my opinion, but I didn't care. 어머니 and 아버지 weren't going to do anything. They weren't even going to try to stop Taeyeol, so it was up to me. In the brief silence that followed, I realized I didn't know what they could do. Lock him in his room? It was so cruel. All of it. The occupation, the war, uncle in hiding, Taeyeol going into the army. I needed to get out of the room. The unfairness of it all was choking me. I whirled and bolted out of the house. I ran out into the garden, all the way to the back, dropped to my knees, and slammed my hand against the stone wall. Over and over, I struck it in fury, hardly knowing what I was doing. In the midst of my frenzy, my wrist was grabbed from behind and held in an iron grip. I wrenched it free and turned around. Taeyeol was standing there. Don't talk to me, I snarled, raising my hand toward him. Shut up, you stupid girl, and listen, he said roughly. I was so stunned by his rude manner that I froze as I was, my hand in the air and my mouth open. Taeyeol knelt beside me. I'm sorry. I spoke to you like that. It seemed like the only way to get your attention. His voice was gentle now. There's more that I haven't told our parents. But I want to tell you because I want someone to know the truth. I lowered my hand but said nothing. He leaned toward me and spoke softly. Sonny, Uncle is still alive and still working for the resistance.